In this video, I'll walk you through the steps I used to create this 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor of a common gallinule. I got photos of this cooperative bird with my brother Ted at Orlando Wetlands in Florida. That location had a ton of beautiful and cooperative birds. The sketch incorporated elements from about 3 different photos that I took with a 500mm lens. I transferred that sketch over to a block of Kilimanjaro 140-pound cold-pressed paper and masked off my main foreground details using liquid Frisket. Before starting any background washes, I always mix all of my background colors. Adjusting and mixing colors while a wash is in progress is something you want to avoid if at all possible. When applying washes, there are two main options. You can do them wet on dry paper or wet on wet paper. Each method has its advantages. Wet on dry gives greater color saturation, but often is harder to get super smooth results. Wet on wet has really soft gradients, but less color saturation given the same amounts of pigment. In this case, I wanted a really soft, blurry look for the top of the image, simulating a low depth of field. So I chose to pre-wet my watercolor paper, making sure it was evenly saturated with water. I applied paint using a 1-inch flat brush with my lightest colors starting at the top and switching colors as I went along. My lightest color was a mix of cerulean and phthalo blue, moving to other color mixes with ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. To prevent backruns, I wicked off any puddling pigment with a dried brush. I also used a number 4 round brush to blot off some areas for reflections on the legs. Once the paint seemed to be soaking into the paper, I hit everything with the hairdryer. With the basic gradient established, I brought in some light glazes for reflections, starting with the legs using some lemon yellow, followed by many green glazes for reflections of the algae. I used a load of different greens in this painting. My base colors were lemon yellow and sap green. A desaturated green option used those same colors, only with some added yellow ochre and ultramarine blue. At times I mixed in more water to decrease the contrast and color saturation. I moved on to rendering the bird's dark reflections. Those were done with mixes of ultramarine blue, Indian red, and dioxazine purple. The reflections in the water were done in many glazes to build depth. I planned on having a focal transition where the bottom of the page had very little focus and detail, moving to a band of greater detail and saturation with the bird, sticks, mud, and algae, and then returning to a really blurred look to the top of the page. To render this, I really kept my detail, contrast, and color saturation lower at the top and the bottom. I faked in a lot of detail early on, knowing that I'd be adjusting much of the water as I started rendering the foreground elements. Once the background was in the ballpark, I removed the Frisket, revealing the white of the page. Afterwards, I transferred the rest of the foreground sketch using a tracing paper transfer and a folding bone. At this point in the watercolor, my goal is always the same, covering up the white of the paper with the lightest local colors. In this case, I was using a number 4 round brush. I usually start with the largest areas first. You'd assume that would be the bird, but in this case, the bird's color shifts quite a bit in several smaller patches, so I chose to work on the algae and the muddy slop that he was walking on. I wasn't super concentrated with matching the colors perfectly at this early point, just in getting a base to leap off from. Knowing the bird had a bright yellow beak and feet, I chose to amp up these colors in the first pass of the background. Likewise, for the muddy sections, I used a similar brown to what will end up being on the bird's back and wings, and this should help harmonize the colors down the road. The bird got many of those same greenish browns that I used in the muddy areas. The belly had some of my dark premixes used for the reflections with ultramarine and phthalo blues, Indian red, and dioxazine purple. The middle tone colors on the bird used some of my background wash that had ultramarine blue and some of the dark mix which I previously described. With all the base colors in, I could start building detail. This is a long process of putting in dozens of light glazes of color. These are mostly done with the sharp number 2 round brush. The early glazes are the wettest, and as I go on, they get progressively darker and drier. My next passes start rendering slightly darker sections of the colors that I just laid down. Often at this point, I'm looking to block in my big shadow shapes. I did some of that here, as well as just scumbling around with my brush, faking in detailed patterns that I can kind of carve into shapes later. It can be hard to know what to work on at this stage in a painting, and it can be tempting to pick one section and work on that until it's complete. I usually avoid that approach. Why? Well, for many reasons, but I'll limit myself to the 3 main ones for now. First, with watercolor, if you put glazes of wet pigments next to a section that's almost complete with layers of paint or dry brushing, the colors are likely to lift and become muddy or lose their sharp edges. Second, it's easy to lose the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish as far as general lighting and harmonized color. Thirdly, people tend to work on the most interesting areas first and never finish the rest of the piece. That's the age-old eating dessert first problem. If you do the fun things first, you lose your enthusiasm for the other parts of the project. Working across the painting a little at a time develops things in a more natural way, and things are more cohesive and have similar levels of detail where you typically want them. Additionally, working around the page helps to keep the art from looking like spot illustrations with no real background or atmosphere to it. That's a long way of saying that I choose to hop around the paper a lot, working on all sorts of different areas, usually with common colors that are already on my brush. Early on in a painting, I do tend to work more on the background and less on the birds because they're usually harder, and they also account for the larger surface area in a painting. Eventually, I put in some more detail on the bird with the next passes of brown and blue-gray. I got back to work on the other foreground elements, and I had some choices to make. Generally speaking, mud and algae aren't terribly attractive things to paint. My reference had a lot of mucky brown, which was pretty ugly and not very interesting to look at. I chose to put in more of the algae. Unfortunately, the algae wasn't much prettier. In my photos, it was more of a sickly, let's say, mucinex color in an amorphous shape. Who wants to look at that? I decided to render it in a friendlier, bright yellowish green with intense saturated darks. Additionally, I played up the striated nature of the folded layers to look more like drapery and give it some better form. That should add some good visual interest. It isn't literally what I saw that day, but sometimes you get some good looking algae, and why not add some in here? There's a lot of area covered by these foreground elements. I wanted them to have convincing depth, but with limited areas of focal interest. To do this, I held back on a lot of details and just suggested shapes, adding only enough sharp edges and information that it looks fairly convincing. If I were to render every last duckweed leaf, it would just be a distraction from the real story. I was also choosing to really hold back on painting the bottom edge of the shoreline. I want that to be an entrance into the painting where you can see the brush strokes and ease your way into the detail and color. These common gallinules are really interesting birds. I had no experience with them until I saw them for the first time in Florida in my 20s. Since then, I've seen them in many states and always enjoy getting a peek at them. While they may not be as glamorous and spectacularly colored as purple gallinules, they still are fascinating and beautiful birds. All gallinules are actually rails, and they do at times act just like other members of that family, like Sora and Virginia rails. They walk carefully through and on aquatic vegetation looking for food. At other times, they appear to be much more duck-like, swimming and floating about like you'd expect to see a mallard. These birds also have a bunch of different calls, varying from croaks, whinnies, and clucks almost to like a chicken. Some of their calls end with a laughing sound. That's pretty cool. For some reason, I never managed to get a good photo of these guys until this year when I got plenty. I never birded in the Orlando area before, and I got a lot of different birds than I had in the Everglades and Fort Myers areas. I added more details to the red and yellow areas of the beak and frontal shield and used some of those same colors on the legs. I needed to really darken up the underside of the bird to give it some good shadow and depth. I did that with a mix of Indian red, phthalo blue, and dioxazine purple. I glazed in browns using burnt sienna and burnt umber to the tail, wings, and back. I also used blues and purples to start rounding out the head and neck more. I occasionally worked on the algae and the mud, but I was mostly concentrating on pushing the bird forward at this point. I used a lot of dark blues and purples to build my depth. Although the bird's belly feathers are pretty much black, we have a lot of reflected sky color bouncing around, so it'll look right to use those blue tones to fill in our shadows. I did start pulling out the 10-aught brush for tiny details of the beak and the feet, but the bulk of the work was done with the number 2 round mimic brush. As I worked, I frequently moved around the page so it would fit the natural movement of my hand when rendering longer lines or repeated feather patterns. You can see at this point from the brown going in on the wings that the glazed colors going in now are thicker layers compared to the initial glazes. As all these passes overlap, it starts to build a convincing texture. Well, the bird received many layers of blues and purples to round it out, especially on the head. Late in the painting, I'm mostly sharpening up edges by adding tiny, dark details. Eventually, I spend more time looking for problems to fix rather than actually painting, and I decide that it's finished. Well, this was a fun one to work on. While I've painted purple gallinules a couple of times, I never got around to doing a common gallinule until now. I was happy with how the water and mucky algae turned out. It was definitely a different sort of background than I typically work on. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you all get a chance to get out the watercolors and paint soon.